Hi, and welcome to History Respawned. This month we're talking about Bioshock Infinite, or to be more specific, a small section of the treatment of Bioshock Infinite on the Boxer Rebellion. And I'm very happy to have with us this month an expert on the Boxer Rebellion, Dr. Jeffrey Wasserstrom from University of California at Irvine, who has most recently written China in the 21st Century, What Everyone Needs to Know, and is currently working on a book on the Boxer Rising and foreign reactions to that rising. Welcome, Jeff. Thanks for coming.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here.
Well, we're really happy to have you, and especially with your current work and kind of your own experience in your career the last few years, reaching out kind of beyond the academy to the public to talk about these issues in Chinese history. Would you mind just introducing for our listeners and our watchers the Boxer Rebellion, just the broad strokes of what it was and what was happening at that time in China, please?
Sure. I mean, it's a funny thing that the term Boxer Rebellion is one of the terms that is recognized by a lot of people around the world from Chinese history. And sometimes I like to say that, it's a perfectly fine term, except that they didn't really box and they weren't really rebels. So I like to talk about it as the Boxer Uprising. And the Boxers were a group of anti-Christian militants. They were rural, mostly young men who were living in China, in North China, in 1900. North China was undergoing a horrific drought, and a group of people, it's really unclear how they kind of coalesced, but drawing on ideas from Chinese folk religion and other ideas, this group became convinced that the reason why there was the horrific drought was because the local gods who took care of providing rain were angry. And the reason why they were angry was because of the incoming of Christianity. The fact that there were missionaries in the area and that there were Chinese Christians, some of whom had been Christians for a long time and some of whom had recently been converted. And this group, that were known in Chinese as the Righteous and Harmonious Fists or Righteous and Harmonious Militia. These were two terms for them. They practiced various martial arts techniques as partly a way to draw a crowd and to get people following them. And what they believed was that if they could drive the foreign religion and all signs of it and all signs of the foreigners out of North China, the gods would be appeased and rain would fall. Mm-hmm. And what they thought was that they could summon down spirit soldiers from the heavens to fight beside them. They knew that the West had more advanced technologies. It's important to remember that foreign armies had been defeating the Chinese armies of the Qing dynasty for decades in a series of wars. The Opium War, 1839 to 1842, the British had defeated the Qing. Unsettling the idea that a lot of people had that China was the most powerful country in the world. Then later in the 19th century, the Qing had lost further wars to Western powers. And then in 1894-95, they'd lost a war to Japan, which was really unsettling to have this smaller country that had been previously in the Chinese orbit defeating China. So you need to have that kind of background of there's a lot of what's going on here. And in the elite groups, there's a debate breaking out on whether China should try to model itself on these more advanced countries with the more advanced technologies, the way that Japan seemed to have when it was developing, or rather whether you could sort of double down on Chinese traditional ways and somehow stand up to them by having a superior civilization. And the Boxers were a kind of last-ditch effort to do that kind of doubling down on traditional ways and then try to drive the foreigners out. The Boxers also believed they could make themselves invulnerable to bullets. And so they rose up. They attacked missionaries and especially Chinese Christians. And then at first the Qing dynasty wasn't sure whether to treat them as bandits, to be suppressed, or as a kind of loyalist militia that might be a little bizarre, but could be used to further the goals of the dynasty. Because the Boxers were saying, drive out the foreigners, support the dynasty. That's why they weren't really rebels. Eventually, the dynasty decided to back them, which was a very fateful move to make, because eventually the Boxers were defeated, and not just the Boxers, but also the dynasty was punished for that. But the highlight of the movement, what was remembered most in the international imagination, was that for 55 days in the summer of 1900, the Boxers, by that point backed up by Qing dynasty troops, kept all foreigners in Beijing held hostage in the diplomatic quarter of Beijing. And then to try to free those hostages, an international army, what we would now call an international peacekeeping force, though that term wasn't used then, was mustered, with soldiers marching under 8 different foreign flags, mostly European powers, but also Japan, the United States, Russia were all part of this relief force. And this 8 allied armies marched into Beijing, lifted the siege, and freed the foreigners who were held captive. But afterward, often in the Western telling of the story, that's where it ends. And, in movies, that's when the credits roll. The foreigners are saved, a threat to civilization is vanquished. But in the Chinese telling of the story, and the way I want to tell the story as well, that's a kind of midpoint, because afterwards, the foreign troops take hold of Beijing. They put on parades of military might to show that they're in control of China's capital. Foreigners loot a lot of the national treasures of the Chinese palaces. And then these international troops go about throughout the country trying to rid the country of all last signs of Boxers, but in the process they carry out atrocities of their own. The Boxers had carried out a lot of atrocities, killing innocent people, but the foreign armies also committed a great number of atrocities during what was a military occupation that had a very savage side to it. So the subtitle of the book I'm writing, I think, will be The Brutal Boxer Rising and the Civilized World's Savage Revenge. So you have the kind of first half of the year 1900, where there's this violence coming from the Chinese side, and then you have the second half of 1900, where you have a lot of campaigns of revenge and retribution, in which a lot of people who had no tie to the Boxers, a lot of innocent Chinese are killed. And there's a memory of this in China as the year of the invasion of the 8 allied armies, while internationally there's more of the memory of it as the year of the brutal Boxer Rising.
Right, yeah, exactly. And this kind of, this is where, we thought of you with Bioshock Infinite a little bit. Bioshock Infinite, which is kind of the idea of Ken Levine, the main developer, who has a long history as a developer, and the first Bioshock game had very clear critiques of objectivism and all the rest. So Levine is very ambitious in what he's trying to do with the game as a whole, but it's interesting how he's kind of playing into some of the dynamics that you just raised, So, for example, in the game, this is a community led by this guy Cornstalk, and it's kind of this very kind of religious infused society, but also tied in with technology. So you were talking about religion as it factored into the Boxers, and so in this community that has this museum that is the mocking and are kind of portraying very barbaric and terrifying portrayals of these Boxer, again, rebels, quote unquote. There's a really interesting kind of fusion of religious values with modernity that's going on there, even in the game. And so this is something that is this is a dynamic that's at play in the actual historical events, or?
Yeah. No, I think there is. We need to think of, actually, in the 19th century, there were a variety of millenarian movements going on in different places, including ones that were within the countries of the West, of course. This was the era of Mormonism and other kinds of ideas of prophets rising up. But some of the prophets were inspired by this desire to even the odds against more powerful threats to them. And there was a famous example in the United States. Would be the Ghost Dance Rising of the Sioux, and and other Native American groups. What I was fascinated by in the game was the pairing of Native American risings with the Boxer Rising. Because they're scholars pair them together in talking about revivalist movements in which a group faced with a technologically superior threat often calls on sort of supernatural beliefs to try to even the odds. And this happened, it happened in the 1890s in the United States among Native Americans. It happened in 1900 in China, but it happens in many other places too. Right before the Boxer Rising in Sudan, there was the Mahdi Rising, another prophet rising up. In Africa, at later points, there have been moments when faced with this kind of existential threat and something that seems hard to fathom, there's this reaching for supernatural things that could even the odds. My favorite story about this, though, that also just shows how you need to not put things too easily in one box or another, is that there's an Oxford historian, Henrietta Harrison, who's a historian of Catholicism in China, who tells this story, who has collected stories from a Catholic village, a longtime Catholic village. And in this village in North China, there's a story that the people there tell about why they survived the Boxer Rising. The Boxers claimed they could summon down spirit soldiers to destroy the Catholics, as well as Protestants. The Catholics in this village tell the story that they were able to defend themselves against the Boxers because when faced with the Boxer threat, they called on the souls from purgatory to come down and fight beside them on the battlefield. So you have this very nice kind of parallel. And you also have, the thing that's supposed to be, that a lot of the Western press, say, covering the Boxers at the time, said, these people are crazy. They think that even when they're outmatched dramatically by a foe, that supernatural, they can call on the gods to come down and save them. But if you read what a lot of missionaries and hostages held said on the Western side, they would say things like, we're terribly outmatched. There are so many Boxers. It may seem that we can't possibly succeed, but we will be saved because we have God on our side. So this idea of being able to even the odds through calling on spirits or a spirit is very powerful on both sides of the event.
Yeah, no, it's really fascinating, and I think one of the things that got me thinking about this game and the Bioshock series is very, very popular, and I wanted to focus in on this one particular angle of the game is because there's this moment where he enters the Hall of Heroes, this museum where they have this entire fabricated portrayal of the Boxers as these kind of terrifying obviously very orientalized caricature kind of figures, and they're coming in waves and waves and waves, and you've got the Chinese drums, at least to the Western ears and everything. It was just a fascinating kind of portrayal for me of how those Boxers are portrayed, and like what did you think of that, and how does that relate to the way that in the West Boxers are being portrayed in what today we'd call popular culture, but kind of in the public sphere, visually, and how they're discussed?
They were definitely being portrayed at that time as savages, and they were being portrayed as fitting in to a variety of stories that people were used to of other kinds of savage threats to civilization at that point. That was very much how the narrative was being told. They were portrayed as demonic figures, as monstrous figures. The oddest thing was that the Boxers had no interest in doing anything that went outside of China. They were only concerned with things locally, but a lot of the projection of this fear was of this invasion, of something that would spill over from China into the West. There were magazines that said this is the biggest threat to Christendom since Genghis Khan, tapping into these very old ideas.
Right.
I think for a contemporary audience, and I do want to make this point in the book as well, there's a lot that's parallel. The fear of China then and the yellow peril then is very parallel to the fear, to the sort of Islamophobia, the fears right now projected onto a violent, hard to understand other coming from the Muslim world. I mean, there was some Islamophobia then too, and there's some obviously fear of Asia, of China now. But I think there's a kind of parallel that in some ways the Boxer Rising became incredibly intense media sensation. It reminds me a little bit of the kind of intense fascination with Al-Qaeda right at the time of 9/11. And then there was later some switch to attention to the crimes that the so-called civilized world was doing, which becomes something like what happened when we started having images of Abu Ghraib and things coming out then. But specifically with Bioshock, I think the pairing with the Native American threat is something that was very powerful in the United States when the Boxers were going on. Something different was going on in, say, England, where the referent wasn't the Boxers being somehow like Native Americans rising. In England, it was more likely, and among the British held in China, to be seen as a recurrence of the kind of threat that had happened in India when during the Indian Mutiny, Sepoy Mutiny of 1857, when some foreigners had been held captive by Indian rebels or insurgents. So there was an idea in all parts of the world that this was something new happening in China, but it was somehow reminiscent of some kind of nightmare that was already in place. And in the United States, the nightmare was in part of Native Americans threatening settlers on the frontier, and China was kind of a kind of new frontier there. And this kind of it resonated very powerfully, and it resonated in popular culture in a very specific way. Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, which was the most important one of the most important mass entertainments of the time, had reenacted the massacre at Wounded Knee and other elements of the Ghost Rising. And in the 1890s, these had been tremendously popular shows. Many people had seen them, both in America and when the company toured. And then in 1901, the Buffalo Bill show put on a new act, and this time Native Americans who were in the cast, who had previously been playing participants in the Ghost Rising, were suddenly playing the Boxers. So there was a way in which, long before this computer game pairs the two together, they were being linked, and there were links in actual biographies as well. One of the person who led the American contingent in that international force that marched into Beijing was somebody, Adna Chaffee, who had begun as a quote-unquote Indian fighter on the frontier. He had actually known Buffalo Bill when Buffalo Bill was spending time there. So when Chaffee was appointed to be the person to lead the American contingent, the American press asked William Cody, a.k.a. Buffalo Bill, what do you think of this? And Buffalo Bill said, yeah, Chaffee's the right guy for the job. The Chinese will quickly learn that he's a match for their, I forget what he said exactly, something like their cruel methods of warfare. So for an audience that was primed to think of these kind of battles between quote-unquote savagery and quote-unquote civilization in terms of stories about Native Americans, they were ready to slot the Boxers into that. At the same time, in China, there was a strong tradition of thinking of the Westerners as monstrous. This is another parallel, I think, between the two sides. And the Boxers, and there had been earlier anti-Christian groups as well. There had been anti-Christian propaganda, and that presented the Westerners as demonic figures who were intent upon destroying civilization. So there was a parallel. There were a lot of parallels going on.
Yeah, I mean, isn't it? I'm trying to remember. I think in Guangzhou in the 1840s, there were various rumors of guessing as to why the Westerners closed the doors to those buildings on Sunday they all went into, and all these kind of increasingly, sensational kind of speculations.
There were rumors. There were orphanages set up by missionaries, and the rumor was that terrible things were being done to Chinese babies.
Right.
When in fact they were trying to save them, and these kinds of things circulated back and forth. So there was a kind of paired notion of the other side as monstrous. I don't know enough about the Native American case to know if that similar kind of parallel went back and forth, but I wouldn't be surprised at all. That's something that often happens in these kinds of situations. Yeah,
and I'd like to ask you a couple more questions here about this idea you're presenting. So we have the two separate narratives, as it were, kind of how the Westerners are viewing the Boxers and how, of course, the Chinese would view them. And there being so many reasons behind this, of course, and you alluded to 55 Days at Peking earlier, that famous film that ends with Chalk Heston reaches down and the little girl with pigtails gets up on the horse in front of him, and that's it. We did it, and the credits roll, as you say. And in the video game, it's this absurdist version of that, where the flying city led by essentially white supremacist evangelicals shows up and wins the Boxer, defeats the Boxers, defeats this threat to our way of life. That's a fascinating, obviously in the game it's quite absurd, but what do you think of that narrative of, we resolved it, we won, salvation came in the end, and as we know afterwards, like you mentioned, there were parades and various things, and civil service exams banned in Chinese cities. What's your take on that Western view that we did it and we can move on to the next step of the progress, the next step of our civilization story now, as it were?
Well, I think one thing to remember is that there were people at the time within the West, though that was the dominant story of it in the West, and I think to the extent it's been remembered, it keeps being remembered that way. And one of the things that happened afterwards was the dynasty, the Qing were driven briefly into exile and then were allowed back on the throne. They were allowed back on the throne providing that they carried out executions of some of the leaders of the Boxers, if they could find them, and also of some of the officials who could be made scapegoats for the fact the dynasty had sided with them. And they had to promise to sort of turn over a new leaf. And afterwards, the Qing dynasty was more conciliatory to Westerners in differing ways. And, there can be a story of it as setting things on the road toward realizing that there needed to be a constitutional monarchy to continue, and eventually there being the 1911 revolution in which Sun Yat-sen, who was a figure that Westerners could relate to, Dr. Sun Yat-sen, could be. So you can tell that story that way. But there were some important voices outside of China who at the time were just appalled by, first of all, had sympathy with the Boxers wanting to get control of their own land back, and also were appalled by what the foreign troops were doing in China. Three of the most famous writers alive in 1900 were either already famous in two cases or soon to become globally famous, all beginning with T: Twain, Tolstoy, and Tagore. All of them wrote in this vein. Twain very famously gave lectures in late 1900s saying, that he would have been a boxer if he were Chinese, because what did the Boxers want? They wanted to control their own territory, and implying that actually the analogy for the Boxers shouldn't be necessarily the ghost dance, but should be the Minutemen, 1776, who tried to drive out foreign oppressors. Tagore, who was in India, was famous in India at that point, but not globally famous so much. He wrote a poem at the end of 1900 about the last sunset of the century setting in blooded clouds. So he had this image, or blood red sunset, different translations of the Bengali. So he had this idea that his sense was just the world was all at war. The world had become such a dangerous place as the centuries end because thinking in part of the foreign troops carrying out these atrocities. Tolstoy, very famous at that point, probably the world's most famous writer at that point, was so appalled by the stories coming back of Russian troops committing barbaric actions in China before and during and after the Boxer Rising, that he penned an epistle to the Chinese people wanting to apologize for his countrymen. So there are plenty of people who, there were some people taking this kind of view outside of China. But I think the more common view outside of China was this triumphalist thing, that the Boxers being suppressed and the Qing dynasty being taught a lesson. There was this triumphalism, like the moment when Saddam Hussein was toppled. That triumphal moment that then there are problems afterwards, but at that moment there was this kind of excitement. The most famous spokesman for triumphalism of the time in the U.S. Was Teddy Roosevelt, who was running for vice president in the summer of 1900, and talked about the idea that he talked about the fact that rebels, insurgents who were pushing back against American imperialism in the Philippines, he said we need to be strong against these. If we give in to them, it would be like giving in to the Boxers. It would be like giving in to the Apaches and the Sioux. So he also brought up these kinds of things, that there were threats in different places, and this inability to distinguish between the different threats, which I think we still see when, for a lot of Americans, it's sort of all a mush. What exactly is the problem caused by ISIS?
Right.
What's the problem in Gaza? I mean, these are quite different kinds of things going on, but they're bundled together. And I think that bundling together was true in 1900. I see 1900 as an early global moment of this idea of news stories from different parts of the world competing for attention at the same time. New technologies weren't just new technologies of war, but there were new technologies of communication. It was early in the time when undersea telegraph cables would carry news from Asia to the West. The next morning you could read about what had happened on the other side of the world. Not quite like now when we follow a Twitter feed minute by minute from someplace else, but people had the same sense that the world has suddenly got knit together so tightly, and the wars are so much more interconnected than they used to be. And what's going on in one place is linked to what's going on in another.
Yeah, I mean, and for the time, the technology to send a telegraph and have the information a few hours later, or even to just send a letter, and it gets to, from Wisconsin to Shanghai in 3.5 weeks or what have you in the early 20th century. This is light speed for those people at the time.
No, people had that sense, and and there was also a global nature to these wars of where the soldiers were. I mean, now we talk about, well, the U.S. wants to fight on so many fronts. How can soldiers be redeployed? There, they were saying the same thing about the British Empire, the biggest superpower of the time, because they were fighting a war in South Africa, the Boer War, and they were fighting. And so soldiers, the question would be, should soldiers be taken from that battle, which was also sometimes seen as civilization versus savagery. Should they be moved? And the American troops were in the Philippines putting down that insurrection, fighting that insurrection. And should they be moved from the Philippines to China? So there was this discussion was being carried on about, and also the orders could be sent much more quickly than before. It took longer for physical troops to get there because it was steamships rather than planes, obviously. Mm-hmm. But people still had a sense that, people as well as news can move faster than ever before.
Right, yeah, exactly. And then it's interesting you bring this up because, Ken Levine, again, this, the developer of the game, I mentioned the first Bioshock game is this very kind of objectivist critique. And as I said, you're tying it to kind of current issues. Levine kind of has either been criticized or praised with the first game for making clear allusions to the Tea Party movement just as it's arising around that time, And in Bioshock Infinite, I'm not sure if I shared footage with you, but you have kind of Franklin holding a key and Washington holding this, the three great fathers of our kingdom, and Abe Lincoln is the enemy, so he has red lights in his eyes in these museums and all this kind of this really interesting kind of narrative. But what Levine was setting out to do with the game before it was made, and he was talking about his next project, was he wanted to critique that kind of concept of American exceptionalism and imperialism, and I think he was definitely reacting to, you mentioned there, Roosevelt, and I think that he's definitely kind of reacting in a big way to that.
That's very funny. I haven't followed it through enough. So there was just something online talking about an article talking about Trump and having Theodore Roosevelt being kind of a precursor to Trump in certain ways, mm-hmm. with playing on these kinds of nativist images. And yeah, I think I'm really interested in Twain being a really high-profile critic of that point of view, and Twain criticized Roosevelt. He actually said he loved Teddy Roosevelt the man, but hated his positions and this kind of thing. So it's there is that kind of parallel there.
Well, I believe that Trump knew Roosevelt and Roosevelt admired him. That's what, at least according to what Trump would tell us. But I think that's great to bring up Twain, and just bring up the fact that there are different reactions to this because of course, Jeff, you and I both teach, and one of the things you're doing, especially when you're teaching certain undergraduate classes that you're not seminar style, they're kind of more lecture style, and the rest, it's important to try and kind of get away from these one note versions, I guess, or one-note narratives that this is how the West reacted. Maybe before, as we're bringing our conversation to an end here, if you wouldn't mind talking a little bit, because I know we talked about this before we started recording, about how the Boxers kind of lived on in kind of Western memory, because one of the things that interests me about this series, History Respawned, what we do, I'm particularly interested in how these games participate in kind of a public discussion about history and about historical dynamics, and there are a lot of pitfalls there, of course, and lots of issues, and with a game like this in particular, there's alternative history. It's trying to do certain things narratively and with creative license, but it's not the first time the Boxers have been referenced since the 1910s. I know that. So I think you mentioned Buffy the Vampire Slayer in previous conversations, and how has that memory lived on?
Yeah, well, the Boxers, early on, there were reenactments filmed of some of the incidents from some of the earliest silent movies. Some of the very earliest silent movies were of the ghost dance, but some of the earliest were reenactments of this. The Buffalo Bill show. There were wind-up toys with some part of the Boxers. There were, I mentioned the Buffalo Bill show. There were toy soldiers with the different contingents that you could buy. And then there were films made at later points. You mentioned 55 Days at Peking, which really does use many of the genre techniques of the Western, but sets it in China in that way. Buffy the Vampire Slayer has a time travel episode where a vampire is going back to remembering attacking a vampire slayer who was a young Chinese woman. And there's a great comic book version of that out where the vampire who's back in Beijing in 1900, somebody's yelling after him, you foreign demon, which, was kind of a slang word for all foreigners, but right. He's actually a foreign demon being a vampire. And at least in the comic book, he says, hey, keep it down. I'm British and I'm a vampire. I've got like 2 strikes against me. There's also a reference to neo-boxers in Neil Stephenson's The Diamond Age, a really wonderful, wild science fiction book set in Shanghai that moves between the past and the future, and imagines a group that taps into the spirit of the boxers to try to do some of the things they believe to later. And there was a whole long period of the boxers became, in Western terminology, a way of dissing any Chinese movement that you wanted that right. could be non-violent anti-imperialist as opposed to blanket violent xenophobic, but to call it new boxerism was to discredit it. But at the same time, I think it's crucial to realize that there was a strong afterlife of the events of 1900 in Chinese popular culture. And in Chinese popular culture, what's often remembered is this brutal invasion by 8 foreign powers. At some points, the boxers are presented as heroes. At some point, the boxers are presented in Chinese texts as misguided. But the real horror is what the Western powers in Japan and Russia did when they were coming in. And just to show how this kind of goes on, and sort of a couple of things. There was a Shaw Brothers movie, Hong Kong film made about the events of 1900. And in the English language publicity, it was The Boxer Rebellion was the title. In the Chinese language publicity, it was the 8 Allied Armies, Baguo Lianjun, that was used to promote it. And there were images like, was this the story of a rising or of an invasion? And we can think about now how the story of 9/11 and the invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan would be portrayed. For different markets, what do you focus on? What do you give attention to both parts of violence or not, or with battles in other parts of the world? But to how deeply this kind of goes, one thing is Deng Xiaoping in 1990, after the June 4th massacre of 1989, there were 7 foreign countries that talked about leveling economic sanctions against China, the Chinese government, to punish them for this. Deng Xiaoping gave a speech in 1990 who says, "I'm Chinese. I know my history. When a group of foreign powers band together to try to punish China, I think of 1900. I think of the 8 Allied armies and what they did to devastate our country." So it's this kind of common referent point that moves in a totally different direction than the idea of 1900 symbolizing a time of just savagery coming from the Chinese side, which is how it's tended to be in popular culture. Oh, one more popular culture thing about the boxers. Fu Manchu.
Of course, yeah.
The Fu Manchu novels and films, he was the most famous supervillain of the early 20th century, invented as this kind of, like the mastermind. He was actually an inspiration, I think, for Dr. No in the James Bond films, but he's this devilish Chinese figure who knows Western science, but also dark art, supposedly linked to China. And what's interesting is that in one of the early Fu Manchu novels, which are very over the top and hyperbolic, and kind of like Sherlock Holmes stories, only if Moriarty were the focus, with Fu Manchu as the focus, there are these Westerners who are trying to defeat Dr. Fu Manchu, and some of them are described, or at least one of them is described as a man who proved his mettle by being in China during the Boxer Uprising and standing up to them as a missionary. But there's also, interestingly, usually Fu Manchu's hatred of the West is not given any backstory, but in one film it is. In one of the films that was made, even though it was presenting Fu Manchu as a horrible demon and all that, they do give him a reason for his hatred of the West, and it's described as the fact that he was originally pro-Western, but then his wife and little child, were killed by the foreign troops who came into China in 1900 to suppress the Boxers, and then killed a lot of people who had nothing to do with the Boxers, including these members of Fu Manchu's family. So that, I think, is a really interesting sidelight in the two kinds of stories coming together in this kind of single, very powerful popular cultural creation.
Yeah, no, that's great stuff. I mean, I just think it's very interesting in this game that, again, in its own kind of absurdist way, the kind of antagonists, I suppose, of the game that the player is trying to defeat, they're very much shaping this historical narrative in their own way, and it's absurd. But it's great to hear some context for how that's carried out on both sides. So it's great. It's great. Well, thank you so much, Jeff. It was great to have you.
Oh, sure. I enjoyed this kind of conversation, and I enjoyed seeing the footage, which really does bring to life the kind of nightmarish imagery that was part of the story of the representation of the time. It would be interesting, of course, to see another version of it that was an alternative history where, say, the 8 Allied armies are defeated and they're the kind of bogeymen who show up and are being knocked down. But that would be, well, we can see if a Chinese game creator ever gets around to that.
Exactly. We're just waiting for the next Chinese game giant, and then then you and I can be happy if we're still playing games.
Yeah, all right.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of History Respawned. Thanks again to our guest, Jeff Wasserstrom, and thank you for watching. Please consider visiting Patreon and supporting us there. Also look out on the YouTube channel for more live streams from Bob and from myself, in addition to the regular History Respawned episodes. See you next time.